First, I'd like to deviate from my assignment for just a little bit and thank Ezekiel, the organizing committee, the scientific committee, and the staff for this amazing conference that they're putting on. So we can acknowledge their work. Okay, second, I have a set of announcements to make. The first is that there are plans to make a special issue in fisheries management and ecology of papers that are presented at this Congress. And the key thing is that you have to inform the Congress that you intend to submit a paper before you go. And then the papers will be due on November 30th, and they should be fully developed papers, the same as you submit to any other refereed journal. The second announcement is the certificates of participation will be available online at the conference site today or tomorrow for those of you who need certificates of participation. The third announcement is that our keynote speech tomorrow will be in Portuguese. So if you're not a Portuguese speaker, make sure to pick up your headphones when you come in the room. Okay, now it's my great pleasure to introduce Robert Arlinghouse. He's a professor of inland fisheries in Humboldt University, where he got all his degrees, his bachelor's, master's, and PhD. He works on issues of he likes it there. Well, if it's a good thing, why leave, right? He works on issues of recreational fishing from an interdisciplinary perspective. He has over 120 publications in the primary literature, including books, edited books, and so on. He's received awards such as the Medal of the Fisheries Society of the British Isles, awards in Excellence in Fisheries Management by the American Fisheries Society. He's the associate editor of the North American Journal of Fisheries Management and the editorial board of Human Dimensions of Wildlife. On another note, I was talking with Ezekiel at the poster session yesterday, and he was telling me what incredible contributions that Robert has made to the organization of this conference. So on behalf of Ezekiel and the rest of us, I'd like to thank Robert for those contributions to the conference. So, Robert.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be here today and talk to you about social value change and recreational fisheries. There is a nice Russian saying that if you want to be happy for one day, you should get really drunk. That works. I tried that out. If you want to be happy for 3 days, you should marry. I didn't try that out, but people say there's some truth in that too. But if you want to be happy lifelong, you should become an angler. So this talk is about understanding why societies don't understand that you can get lifelong happiness by becoming an angler. In fact, there is increasing pressure on recreational fishing, declining recreational fishing rates in some countries, and moral questioning of the activity. So how can this be reconciled with internal happiness? And I'm guessing you have noticed that social value change probably plays a role in this picture. So I'm going to tell you theory about what values are. I will give you a background on postmodernization theory as the biggest theory to explain value change, and then give you 3 examples how values might affect participation, fisheries management, and the moral acceptability of recreational fishing before I will conclude my talk. Values are a fluffy term, so to speak. It's common in everyday's language. We all use the term all the time. But of course, there's also very rigorous definitions in the scientific community, which sometimes causes confusion among people that are not well trained in those scientific use of the term values. Also, there are different scientific disciplines that each use the term differently. For example, in philosophy and ethics, value is a very important concept, distinguishing, for example, between intrinsic and instrumental value. That's an important concept in biodiversity conservation. For example, do we conserve species because they have an intrinsic inherent value, or do we conserve species because they have some tangible so-called instrumental value to us humans? So philosophers talk a lot about value. Also, economists talk a lot about value. We have heard yesterday by Brett Gentner the classical perspectives. Economists use values a little bit differently. They talk about how things are valued. So it's not about what people have in their brain in terms of the value system, but how certain actions, policies are valued, usually using monetary terms as the criteria or the unit of comparison. So in other words, the main conclusion is, for example, the policy A is valued more than the policy B. I'm not going to talk about that definition of value at all in this talk. So forget that. I'm just going to say that this is also a definition that exists. What I will be talking about is about the use of values in the discipline of sociology, and more specifically in social psychology, where we talk about basic values that each of us humans, carry around as we move through the world, and also cultural values that are kind of the aggregation of the individual values within a given society. So that's what I will be referring to when I talk about values. So what are values from a social psychological perspective? They are desirable goals that motivate action. So there's a normative emphasis, a goal that I as a human being want to pursue, and values help me put meaning to those goals. They are linked to affect, to emotions, and this is a reason why we have often value conflicts when we talk about biodiversity conservation, fisheries management. Values always tap into emotional responses, and we humans are very much driven by emotional responses. Values serve as standards, and they are ordered by importance. So there are several values that people will carry, and we order them according to importance and according to the goals that we have in life. And values, fourthly, are very general. They transcend situations. They work in our workplace, but also in our partnership. They work in school when we deal professionally with situations. Values transcend situations. They affect specific attitudes that we form towards very specific issues, like do we like stocking? That's a very specific issue, and our value will inform our attitude towards that, and it might affect also the behaviors that we show as we move through life. So values are part of our personality. They are shaped by both genes, but also socialization and the culture in which a given individual is raised, and they change extremely slowly, only across generations. In order for values to exert an effect, they need to be activated by a situation that confronts us with a given decision. And then we look at our values, and they are activated, and then we make a response to that situation. Research has shown that we should not overemphasize or overestimate the importance of values for behavior. Maximally 25% of the variance in human behavior is determined by values, but that's a large amount. 25% deterministic, so to speak, how we behave is a pretty important contribution. Cross-cultural psychologists have developed a set of basic values that happen to be in place across nations, across the world. So every country, every nationality, individuals within that, there are 10 basic values people look at. And these values are here, the black ones in the center of this circle. So you see here, for example, values like security, traditionalism, conformity, values of power. So people, these are values that emphasize power over resources and about other people. They are also very individual or values that are very open to change, such as self-direction and stimulation. And here you have values that deal with how we deal with other people and the environment, particularly the value of universalism and benevolence. What is important in these 10 values, you can score as an individual on all of them, but there are trade-offs, and these are shown by these red lines. So in other words, if you score high on universalism, so in other words, you care a lot for other people around you, and you care a lot for the environment, you usually score very low on power. So you can't have both values. They are opposites. They are trade-offs to each other. And essentially, as you move around this circle here, you can see those trade-offs very clearly. So either people are very open to change, or they are very traditional. So conservation in this respect is not nature conservation. Traditional values are important. You can be, you have values that are towards self-enhancement or towards self-transcendence. So you care a lot about yourself or about others. Usually it's incompatible to have both. So essentially these are 10 values, and of course now you can do research how this varies across cultures and how different nations actually develop these values. And this is what has been done. So you have to distinguish individual values that we as individuals carry, from cultural values, which is not the aggregation, but it's the culture in which a society unfolds. And the cultural values are, so to speak, the average individual values. And research in 76 countries has shown tremendous variation among the world in the cultural values that societies have. So the cultural value is not a psychological variable. It is something that characterizes the nation or the entire society and then affects how society deal with societal level problems. So cultural values tell you whether a society develops authority or whether they develop very liberal rules and regulations. Cultural values tell you whether a society is environmentally open and has environmental laws, or whether they have laws that determine development of nature. So cultural values really set the broader picture in which individuals then develop. That's very important to distinguish individual values and cultural values. What is really striking, if you look at the global map here, is the diversity, but also the axes that different societies characterize. For example, Western Europe scores extremely high on egalitarianism. Egalitarian societies emphasize concern for others, concern for the environment, taking care of the well-being of all people and of all animals. So this explains why egalitarian societies have very high conservation laws, but also animal welfare laws. It explains why egalitarian societies have social security systems, for example. At the opposite level, you have hierarchical societies. Again, you can't usually get both. It's a trade-off. Hierarchical societies really emphasize authority, order, very ordered interactions among people, and little individualism. And so the second big axis here is embeddedness versus autonomy. As the word suggests, embeddedness societies actually think of the individual as part of the collective. What counts is the well-being of the collective, the community, so to speak. So you embed yourself into this community, while autonomous societies really emphasize individual well-being, curiosity, creativity, pleasure, and things like this. The US is a very particular society here, which scores very, very high on mastery. Mastery, cultural values emphasize competitiveness, individualism, the desire to transform both social and natural environments to achieve progress. So that's the mastery dimension. They score relatively low on egalitarian levels. So I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, and there's a little disclaimer here. I will, because of my history of being raised in Western Europe, will mainly talk about situations there. I'm not fully informed about Asian culture and so on. What I just wanted to highlight here is that these cultural values, which is the average value that an individual in society carries, has fundamental consequences for recreational angling, because it will affect how recreational angling develops, the acceptability of the activity, and which management strategies are accepted by society. Values are not static. Values change slowly, but they can change. And the biggest theoretician looking at change in values is Engelhardt, who basically has put forward a rather straightforward theory. The theory says that as society with a very, you start basically as a very traditional, ordered society that scores high on authority. As societies develop, he calls it modernize, which usually means industrialization, generation of wealth, and distribution of work in different service industries, not just agricultural, but also service industries. Values change, the achievement motivations become more important, so authority, the importance of God and families decline, and individualism and the individual well-being is increased in importance, because survival needs are declining. So people are not struggling with finding food anymore, with satisfying basic needs that society has. So you can focus more on self-expression, on quality of life, on autonomy, which then, as society moves forward from an industrialized society to a post-industrialized society, gets even increased in importance. So there's a de-emphasis on authority and an emphasis on well-being. So in other words, industrialization and post-industrialization will strongly affect the values, the cultural values a society will carry. So there are two competing theories here. We have Engelhardt, who has these two dimensions, from traditional authority to secular rational authority in the one dimension, and survival towards self-expression in the second dimension. And industrialization would mean that societies move from a very traditional value system to a very liberal value system towards one that emphasizes complete liberalization of minorities, liberalization of human rights, gays, female rights, the importance of ecology and nature, etc., scoring very, very high here on the right side. This is in complete correlation with the Schwartz theory that I just described before on the global map. So you have here the first dimension is really moving from the hierarchy cultural values to egalitarian cultural values. And on the second axis is the movement from embeddedness to autonomy. So in other words, with post-industrialization, societies are expected to move towards the far right here to emphasize egalitarian values and autonomy of individuals. And that will, as I show later, have important consequences for recreational angling. So to simplify the argument, I'm sorry that I'm simplifying a very complex situation, but for the sake of argument, maybe you allow me to simplify. As we develop economically, in other words, we increase the per capita GDP, for example, the gross domestic product, as just one measure of economic development, there is a shift in values from survival-oriented values to well-being-oriented values. So there is a shift in focus from economic gains towards a culture that emphasizes lifestyle, individual well-being, the ability to self-express yourself, and to focus on other values than just securing survival. That's the theory. And now we'll give you some examples how this might actually affect recreational angling. I've chosen three. I will start with a perspective on angling participation. So looking at the global map, how many anglers participate in a given society, and whether we can relate this to these underlying shifts such as urbanization and economic development. If you're interested in the details, there's a paper associated with that in fisheries management and ecology. It's online early, so the details are in this paper. Go back to the life cycle of fisheries that was actually initially described by Smith. And the interesting feature here is that there was the prediction developed rather long ago that with economic development of society, commercial fisheries usually in inland waters tends to decline, for several reasons, changing human demands, but also fisheries being not the prime occupational choice of many people. So if you have alternatives, people go into the service sector. So that declines commercial interest too. And recreational fishing then kicks in. So essentially people have time, they have leisure time, they have the monetary resources as the economy develops, and recreational fishing interest really booms. So transitional economies, such as Brazil, probably are on these ascending limbs, so there's really sharp increase in recreational fishing, but we have also noticed that at some point the situation declines again. So post developed or post-industrialized society face declining interests in recreational angling. These are some data from Berlin, Germany. You see these patterns. These are the numbers of commercial fishermen in Berlin. These are the inhabitants, as you can see, from 1450 to today. And these are the number of anglers. So at some point, the recreational anglers kick in, achieve a maximum, and we see now a declining interest in recreational fishing. A strikingly similar pattern as the more global perspectives that I've shown you before. But if you look in many, many industrialized societies, you see actually declines in recreational fishing interest. These are data from the US. We have the same data from France, from England, from Canada. It seems that recreational angling is declining, despite the money that people have, despite the leisure time that people have. Still, there's a decline. How can we explain this? So what Steve Cook and me did a couple of years ago is compile all available data on national participation rates across the world. I did a heavy screening later to determine the reliability of these data, and I've only retained here rather reliable estimates of angling participation rate. You see great variation, which is good for trying to understand that variation. In Central Europe, very highly urbanized people, less than 5% usually of the population fishes recreationally. Participation hotspots are Scandinavia, Australia, but also part of North America. That's good. So what we did next, or what I did next, was compile demographic indicators, indicators of urbanization and post-industrialization to try to explain the variation across the countries. What I did is treat all individual states of the US as countries, simply because they are very good data and there's huge variation, say, between Texas and California. So it is the same culture, but there are differences. So we can probably learn something by including the states and the Canadian provinces as countries in the data set. So I worked with around 100 data points in the end. This is the best predicting model of recreation participation. It explains over 60% of the variation. And what you see is our prediction receives very high support. As the GDP increases, recreational angling interest declines. Similarly, as societies urbanize, so the population density booms, gets up, the angling interest declines highly significantly. So this basically confirms the declining slope here. And the reason is we don't have good data for many of the transitional economies, so they are not part of the regression model. We can't get a maximum, but we see a decline here associated with post-industrialization. That's how we interpret this first result. Secondly, we see that actual demographic indicators of a given society have a huge explanatory power of recreational fishing interest. So these are data at the country level, yeah? So the median age of a society, the mean household size of a society, the mean weekly working hours of a society, and the unemployment rate. And what you find here is an aging population, actually there's a decline. A highly significant decline. Societies where people are on average, or the median age is larger, have lower angling rates. The household size has a huge, and actually the biggest negative effect, which I interpret simply as a resource problem. So societies where you have to take care of lots of family members, usually you have less time available to invest into recreational angling. Mean weekly working hours has a positive effect. The maximum value reported here is 42, I think, hours per week, so it's not excessive. So I interpret this as the need for leisure. So people who work more actually recreate more. That's how I interpret that variable. And unemployment rate has a negative effect, which again is a resource problem. High unemployment rate means you have less money available, and all other things being equal, that reduces your propensity to engage in fishing. So what these variables tell you is that demographic change as well as resource availability has a fundamental influence on how many people fish in a given society. The next factor is a water factor, and that has the least influence of all of the ones that I tested. So whether a given society has high water areas available, fresh water areas, has a positive effect, but the standardized beta is the lowest value of all. So essentially, you can have high angling participation in countries with limited water or with high water. That is not the fundamental driver of recreational fishing interest. And access to marine waters even is not significant. So there is overall no significant effect whether a country is bordering a coast or not. So in other words, overarching societal level changes and demographic changes have greater effects than anything that has to do with resource availability, access to water, etc. Interestingly, the final factor that we found out is in what we call an index of cultural importance of fish. So countries that have high annual landings of commercial fish also host more anglers. So I interpret this really as a cultural importance of fish in a given society. We can also find that the per capita fish consumption rate is a very good indicator or predictor of angling participation rate. So that's the first indicator that culture also plays a fundamental role in this picture. And unfortunately, I don't have the value data for all the US states, so I couldn't include the value data that I just showed you before in the overall model, but we have a very strong relationship between hierarchy values and recreational fishing interests. So societies that score low on hierarchy, so they have a more egalitarian society, have greater recreational fishing interest. So again, an indicator that in addition to demographics and economy, size of economy, also culture has a fundamental role. And you can see this also in a cross-sectional data here from Germany. So we contrasted the value systems of non-anglers, people that fished previously but no longer fish, and active anglers. And although the differences are not fundamental, you can see here, for example, on the power value, that the anglers and the former anglers actually score higher compared to the non-anglers. And as you know, societies, as they develop, they de-emphasize power values, they de-emphasize authority, and that will shift people from the active angler population in the non-angler population. So to summarize this first data, if we want to understand angling participation, there are lots of things that affect angling participation interest. But one of the big things are cultural change. So culture and values changes affect the general interest of society to participate, and of course then a lot of other things play a role, such as the ability to go fishing, so access plays a role, the social norms in society, so whether angling is something that your peer group also does, for example, your habits, for example, of your parents. Of course there are many other variables that influence it, but culture plays a role. And what is very important to realize is that we have, with post-industrialization, a lot of structural and social changes going on that all are negatively impacting recreational fishing. So with urbanization, for example, access declines, socialization declines. So people are raised up in an urban environment. They are not interacting very intensively usually with rivers and lakes. So the entire importance of rural lifestyles declines. And that is probably a much greater impact of urbanization than cultural change. But I expect that urbanization through the socialization has a much greater negative effect and explains the decline that we see in urbanized societies. So that is at the level of the participation, so how many people actually engage in fishing, and value plays a role. Then we have fisheries management. So how does value affect fisheries management? And so we basically have to look at philosophy for a moment. So which subjects and objects have to be considered morally for their own sake? So we have here the situation of some societies or some value system emphasizing anthropocentric values. So it's important to develop the environment so humans benefit. Yeah? So you modify the ecosystems, you stock fish of a species that people want. That's a very anthropocentric perspective. I skip that one for the moment because that I will tell you later. At the third level, we have biocentric value systems. So biocentric value systems value all biota, also fish populations, habitats, scenic beauty, etc. And at the extreme case, we have holism, so where biota and abiota are valued. And as you urbanize, as the society develops economically, there's a predictable shift towards emphasis on biocentric values in society. A shift away from anthropocentrism to biocentrism. There are very good data showing evidence for this. So for example, here again, per capita GDP increases, index of environmental concern is very high. So societies that are very rich and wealthy and developed also care a lot about environment. So they have a shift towards a biocentric value system going on. And this is changing the face of accepted fisheries management actions. And I give you just an example of fish stocking, and that illustrates that point very clearly. So these are some periods which I want to distinguish for the sake of argument. If you look in history about the use of stocking and introduction of fish, you can see that from the 1800s to about 1930, with industrialization and the decline of habitats, people actually engaged a lot in stocking of fish. And particularly also, around the change of the 19th century, the introduction of new fish was heavily emphasized. The idea was that stocking and introduction could compensate for habitat change, but could also foster angling experiences and fishing experiences by enriching the communities with new species that were never present. So for example, we got all the rainbow trouts and largemouth bass and everything from the US. You got brilliant carp from us and brilliant brown trout that are causing some issues now. But at that time, it was seen as a logical solution to maintain high fishing quality, to combat anthropogenic change of environments. There was no questioning of the introduction at all. It was seen as a great idea, and this is what went on. To around 1930, I would say. You see here a couple of time points in the German environment, but there are other papers that pretty much tell the same story from the US, for example. Interestingly, in Germany, we have a second phase of artificial enrichment. As you might remember, there was this wall in Berlin. There was communist Germany after the Second World War, and that was again a society where economic hardship was present. So survival needs were relevant, and the response to that was adding Asian carp, which the US also loves nowadays. But it was an idea to increase production of ecosystem, self-sustain the society with a fishery that is based on non-native fish. It was not questioned. It was seen as something good to do, an anthropocentric perspective of the world. Yeah? So you see the second phase of this in the GDR. In Western Germany, that was, of course, not happening anymore. So we were already entering the second phase, which was still combating anthropogenic change, but in addition, we want to optimize fisheries yield, but not with non-native fish. So there was a big shift towards preserving native communities and optimizing stocking strategies. Yeah? So that was a phase of science-based assessment, which stocking strategies work best, how to optimize the fishery. And then, since the 80s, we really have moved into the biocentric age. So nowadays, conservation of biodiversity is the more important value. So stocking is seen as something really negative because it can affect genetic diversity, it can introduce non-native genotypes, etc. So now society places a very high burden on a traditional fisheries management practice and substantially questions its future. And we have seen huge debates between nature conservation interest and fisheries interest, because fisheries interest emphasize the traditional use of stocking and is often not so prepared to engage into alteration of stocking practices. So again, society, as it changes the values, it affects not only participation, but also what is seen as proper way of managing a resource. And this is fundamentally about value. So biodiversity conservation is the buzzword, but it matters which biodiversity. So nobody is really asking for the Black Plague or Ebola virus or anything else to be reintroduced. So the whole discussion about conservation biology, biodiversity conservation, is a discussion about values, selectively emphasizing native biodiversity and selective species that society finds important. So it is a value debate in its foundation. And how strong the change is seen here. We have asked the German public, over 1,000 people, what are accepted reasons to go fishing recreationally or go hunting recreationally. And what you see is that, first of all, catching fish for food is more accepted, 62% accept that, compared to hunting game for food. So recreational angling is more accepted as commercial angling if it is for food. But the ecological justification for both hunting and fishing, which I don't know how you can justify fishing. There is some justification here to reduce damage of wildlife, but the ecological justification, you go fishing to manage fish stocks, you go hunting to manage wildlife, receives much greater acceptability than going fishing for getting food. So an ecological reason for the activity nowadays is more accepted than the traditional reason to go fishing to just eat fish, which I find extremely fascinating evidence of this shift from anthropocentrism to biocentrism. Some broad goal of biodiversity and ecology is something that the German society really values. And you see it here in the acceptability of their practice. So we can add another layer here. So as you move to a very rich country, angling interests decline, and something broad called conservation interests become extremely dominant in the way fisheries are managed. But it can get even worse, different, more challenging for the recreational fishing sector, because value change might affect the moral acceptability of fishing. And we have seen some of that yesterday with this little silent protest here. But that is an indication of what I'm just referring to. The acceptability of the practice itself is increasingly questioned. A paper on this for the details, but we have studied this in an egalitarian society. As I mentioned to you, the egalitarian societies are particularly prone to develop institutions, rule systems to deal with the well-being of everybody, including nature and animals. And a good example is Germany, where we have a very strict animal welfare law and changes that have really affected recreational fishing intensively. So basically, we are at this center here, a pathocentric perspective of the world. Pathos from Greek pain, it's a pain-centered perspective. So people that carry a pathocentric worldview actually think that you should not induce pain to anybody, including animals. So that is what I'm going to talk about now. And we see here some data from US states and Germany. The public acceptance of the statement, angling fish for sport is cruel. And you see here a nice linear relationship that as a society urbanizes, the fraction of people that think that angling for sport is cruel substantially increases. Cruelty can't exist without pain. You would never say somebody is cruel to a donut. That's impossible. So cruelty is tied to pain. In other words, this perspective is a pathocentric worldview, so to speak. Academically, pathocentrism is a dominant perspective in so-called animal liberation philosophy. Animal liberation philosophy says as long as an animal is able to feel pain, you have duties towards that animal. And usually recreational fishing is assumed to not generate enough benefits to justify the pain infliction on fish. So people that feel strongly for animal liberation don't like fishing, fisheries management, etc. You should distinguish that from animal rights. Animal rights perspective is independent of pain. That basically says there's an intrinsic value to an animal, and you as a human have no right to inflict with the well-being of that animal. So animal rights is the most fundamental perspective. It's really fundamental. It doesn't like fishing at all. You should not use animals at all for human benefit. So that's the most radical perspective. And animal welfare is the most liberal. Animal welfare perspective simply says you should make sure that you induce the least harm on the individual animal. You should reduce stress, you should do a quick catch and release event, etc. I think Steve Cook will talk more about that. But what I'm referring to is a cocktail of animal liberation and animal rights, so which leads to a fundamental questioning of the use of fish. A fundamental questioning on the use of fish. To study this, US colleagues have developed very nice value orientations. So that's In contrast to values, value orientations actually show your ideology related to a particular domain, such as nature, environment, the workplace, in our case, wildlife and fish. And the wildlife value orientations that can be distinguished is domination, also called utilitarism, and mutualism. And you see here on this picture what basically these two value orientations mean. The domination orientation is a value of human mastery and domination of wildlife. It views humans as being allowed to catch fish, to use wildlife for human benefit. In contrast, well, actually these are not bipolar. You can score high on both. You can score low on both. So these are not bipolar scales, just two different value orientations. Mutualism says wildlife is able to have a relationship with us, or we have a relationship towards wildlife, so we should take care of wildlife's well-being. That's the mutualistic value orientation. And there's a nice scale developed in how you can measure these things, and we were asking the German public all these questions about how they like fishing or dislike fishing, and we also squeezed in these items to measure the value orientations and use them to predict anti-angling sentiments. Why is that important? Well, with increasing universalism, that is a component of egalitarian cultural value, we see an increase in mutualism. These are the data from Germany. So as societies become more well-being oriented, more egalitarian, mutualism increases. So this value orientation declines and these value orientations increase. And we have also evidence from the US that there's consistent variation in the fraction of mutualists in the given states depending on the urbanization level. So urbanized states carry many more mutualists in society than less urbanized states. So again, urbanization, economic development changes the affluence, the need structure, and fish and wildlife is increasingly viewed, so that our hypothesis, as companion animals, as a romantic animal that is nice to observe, but it's less a food or resource that we depend on for survival. So that's the idea, and the hypothesis was whether these predictions hold towards the acceptability of recreational angling. So we did this study, and the first big result, we asked people about the general opinion of recreational fishing and recreational angling. You see here a scale from very good to very bad. What is interesting is only a third of people have a positive image of recreational angling. A fifth of the people are really negative. We also had open-ended questions to start the interview. What image do you have from recreational angling? And then people just said something. When you analyze them, 25% have a decisively negative view on recreational angling. Something like, it's boring, but also they are cruel, they are torturous, they are destroying nature. So really negative, 25% around of the German public. What is extremely relevant is these 40% indifferent people that have no opinion at all. You can imagine that with proper media coverage and proper lobbying, you can easily carry these people to the left or to the right. So there is not a huge support for recreational fishing already in our society of Germany. It's only 37% that thinks it's a good thing to do. Even if I'm not an angler, I think anglers are nice, right? So it's only a third of people, and even less for the hunters. It's only a fifth. So with that in mind, we developed a psychological model. So we actually hypothesized that if a person on the street has to develop an attitude towards recreational angling, a very specific attitude, it will draw on his or her value orientations to make up that attitude. In other words, value orientations will affect very general beliefs about animals, for example, how similar animals are towards us humans, which will then in turn affect how people value or evaluate angling, and then at the behavioral level, whether people would actually sign a petition or actively work for banning recreational angling. So that's the ultimate behavioral level that we modeled. So we measured our domination and mutualism value orientations. We then measured the degree to which people think animals are similar to us humans. So we measured whether people think a trout has ability to be intelligent, to feel pleasure, to feel pain. So a series of human traits, and we ask people, do you think a chimpanzee, a dog, a cat, and a trout have these qualities? So that's anthropomorphism, and we thought that the stronger people think that animals or fish feel pain, the more negative they should be towards recreational angling. We also measured the animal rights attitude. That's the general opposition of animal use in general. So no use of leather, no use of milk, etc. Of course, you assume the higher you score on animal rights, the less you like fishing. Then we measured very specific attitudes, the moral acceptability of angling for food, and the attitude towards catch and release, which is often seen as the opposite of fishing for food. You just go for fun. It's very much criticized in the German society. And finally, we asked people whether they would support a ban on recreational angling. We studied over 1,000 people, and we run a structural equation model to fit the coefficients in this hierarchical structure of logical reasoning. So this is based on the cognitive hierarchy model of human thought and action. Here are the results. As you can interpret these coefficients, as they are called path coefficients, as regression coefficients, and you see here a clear pattern. People who score high on domination score low on mutualism. People who score high on domination have a low tendency for anthropomorphism. So in other words, don't believe as much that fish or other animals feel pain. And people who score high on domination have a very unfavorable attitude towards animal rights, so that's all how you would predict. The same holds for the mutualism, just in the opposite direction, so that's how we would predict the situation. What is really interesting and striking is the lack of predictive power of anthropomorphism. So no matter how strong you think animals are like us humans, no matter how strong or not strong you think, it does not affect your moral acceptability of angling for food. And also the path coefficient on catch and release attitudes is very small. It's significant, but it's small. So even if you think fish feel horrendous pain on the hook, it does only very lightly affect your attitude towards catch and release. This was a very striking result for me. I discussed this with a very prominent psychologist because I thought that we did a mistake or something. But he checked the data. He said, this is waterproof. It seems that these specific attitudes towards fishing are driven by very abstract principles. It's rather independent of whether pain exists or not. It's really driven by very abstract principles of various orientations, and it's strongly driven by the attitude towards animal rights. So if a person develops an animal rights attitude, in other words, a general opposition to animal use, it carries over towards angling. So that's ideology-driven attitude towards angling in the expected directions. And all the rest is as expected, so people that hold a very unfavorable attitude towards catch and release support a ban towards fishing, and people that score low on the moral acceptability of angling for food also are more interested in banning recreational angling and would even sign a petition to do so. Currently, 15% of the German public would actually engage in action rather than being a political voter or expressing their attitudes by other means. 15% would actually do stuff against angling. So at this point, so the model was pretty good. At this point, anthropomorphism was measured at the general animal level, but we also tested whether the situation changes, whether you anthropomorphize trout as a model for fish. The relation increases a little bit, but not substantially. So again, whether trout feel pain or not, it's rather independent of how you morally judge catch and release, fishing in general, and whether you would support a ban on fishing. It's not about scientific fact whether fish feel pain or not. So, do we have a value change that goes into that direction of increasing domination or reduced domination, increasing mutualism? We don't have long-term data, but I can look at the cohorts in the German public, from non-anglers, lapsed anglers, and anglers, how strong they score on domination. And as you can see, the older cohorts score more strongly on domination. The younger cohorts, and that's an indication of value change, score much less. We see the same pattern for mutualism. We can't distinguish between a cohort effect and an aging effect, but we know from other studies on values that the aging effect is low. So this actually supports the idea that the new cohorts that grow up in German society are much less domination-oriented, much more mutualism-oriented. And if that's true, we would expect this pattern to increase in importance, right? More people becoming mutualist, more moral burden acting on recreation angling. And it's present already in the average scores. We see here that the active anglers and the lapsed anglers have a higher score on domination, but they don't differ on mutualism very much. The current generation of non-anglers and anglers are, of course, raised in the same cultural environment, so they are pretty similar in their value system. And it was very interesting for us to see that the anglers that we studied scored very high on domination, but also on mutualism. This is not schizophrenic at all. I mean, you are an angler, you go fishing to appropriate fish, but at the same time you have respect for fish. And this is, for example, evident in catch and release. If you go for fly fishing or maybe the carp anglers that actually care for the individual that they capture. They don't want to damage it and so on, but they want to catch it. So there is this element of mastery and mutualism that actually characterizes anglers. So these are not opposing opposites. You see, of course, the biggest effect on the animal rights attitude. So the animal rights attitude is much, much lower in the former anglers and the anglers compared to the non-anglers. So there is some form of value shift going on in the society. And if you look at the world, this value shift is going on in many countries. So unfortunately, time series are not complete, but in many situations there are 20 years among measurements. So these are from the Engelhardt value system. And without going a lot of detail, here you see Sweden going up, here you see Norway going up, here you see East Germany going up, Japan. So there are many post-industrialized wealthy countries that are all moving towards the far right end, meaning you have increasing emphasis on self-expression, on autonomy, on egalitarianism. You have a reduced emphasis on authority, a reduced emphasis on survival needs. In other words, change that is conducive to question recreation angling on moral grounds sooner or later. And definitely change questioning traditional management practices such as introduction of non-native fish or translocation of different populations and mixing populations, etc., indiscriminately. Definitely, these changes will affect biocentrism and maybe even pathocentric perspectives. And this joins in times where angling interest declines. So these are the population density data that I just showed you before as a standardized beta coefficient. You see actually an exponential decline in angling participation rates as the urbanization kicks in. So value change joins with lower fraction of society that actually engages in recreation angling. So the support base declines while the critique increases. So we would expect that societies with an egalitarian culture system actually then develop rules and regulations to govern these activities. And to close my talk, this is what I'm going to show you here, is how Germany actually dealt with this. In the 80s, when all this movement of liberalization, well-being, self-expression, etc., really kicked in, the actions towards constraining recreational angling on moral grounds increased. And it was based on an animal protection law that, ironically or not, was developed in 1933 during Nazi Germany, which I can tell you a lot about why that happened, but it has the same general thread, right? And the Animal Protection Act, animal welfare is also part of the German constitution. So it's a state goal to care for the well-being of animals. I mean, that is a pure expression of egalitarianism. We care for the well-being not only of us humans, but also our fellow creatures. And that leads to the animal protection being part of the Constitution. And one very important clause is that you need to have a good reason to inflict pain, suffering, and damages to animals in general. And then there were court cases that then challenged recreation angling practices. And the court said, well, what are reasonable reasons? It's harvest. So if you go subsistence angling, so to speak, that's fine. Or maintaining an ecological balance, that's another good reason. If you go for any other reason to find a winner in a fishing competition, if that's your goal, unfortunately, you're not allowed to fish anymore. So this is how cultural values work. Cultural values don't work at the individual, it works at the design of society. The rule systems, the laws, how schools work, how firms work, that's how cultural values express themselves. And this is an expression of an egalitarian society. That meant voluntary catch and release was illegal. So in the 80s, you said if you go fishing and you release a fish that you can take, based on population reasoning, it's over the minimum length limit, you need to take it. You are not allowed to just go fishing and release it, because that is not harvest orientation. It is not allowed to use live bait fish anymore. If you get a fish, you have to kill it immediately by percussive stunning, or how do you say? You have to kill the fish to reduce the suffering of the animal. You can't do weighings anymore. Effectively, you can't do fishing competitions, because it's the prime motive is competition, winning, etc. It's not harvest or ecological balance per se. Of course, anglers find way around it, right? So now they do competitive fishing, but they call it management fishing. Oh, there are overabundant cyprinid stocks. We need to reduce the abundance. So we meet and catch as many as we can and kill them, because they're overabundant. And society says, that's good, that's an ecological reason. So, see, there are a lot of schizophrenic results, but the key message is clear, right? An egalitarian society says reduce the suffering to the degree needed and justify if you induce pain and suffering or stress. It's actually independent of pain and suffering. Stress alone would justify these actions. So this was how institutions, the rule system develops. It went into the animal welfare, from the animal welfare law into fisheries legislation, and we asked society now, hey, do you agree with this? So the general public's view currently in society drastically differs from this. So this is the perception of the activity being immoral in terms of percentage of the German public. All of these practices are currently prohibited, but only 3 of them actually receive a majority vote. So more than 50% think live bait fish is really bad, competitive fishing is not to be done, and you should really kill the fish right away and not just let it flop around and die slowly. But all other practices that are heavily constrained by the institutional level, society has no problem with that. Why not? Put and take fishing is harvest orientation. You put out a fish, you recapture it, you eat it. Society has no problem with that. Keep nets for retention usually is done to keep the fish safe and clean until you take it home. Society has no problem with that. Catch and release of harvestable fish, in general, society has no problem with that. So you can see how culture may affect rule systems that they don't align with what people in society at the bottom ground want. Yeah? So that's something we have to keep in mind, that it can go really strict without taking care of what society actually wants. And for the catch and release case, this is the more or less the final slide. Again, why do people actually, or under which conditions does the German public think catch and release of harvestable fish is allowed? Again, you see ecology emerging. So this is the fraction of people that finds these justifications for the catch and release event acceptable. And in green, all of these are majority votes for justification of a catch and release event for an ecological reason. So you release a fish because it belongs to a protected species, biodiversity protection. 83% think that's what you should do. You should release fish because when they are so small that they haven't reproduced yet. Or when they are so large that they have many eggs and a big contribution to the stock. 64% think, well, that is okay. And also, interestingly, if the angler shows respect for the individual. Yeah? In that situation, also the catch and release event is accepted. But when you have very egocentric reasons for catch and release, you do it because you want to recapture that fish, or your fellow buddy wants to recapture the fish. If you do it to make a picture and show it to your friends,
this type of catch and release is actually the majority is against it. So the message here is, it's not what happens to the fish that matters for moral judgment. What matters is the intention of the person performing the act. And if people think the intention is immoral, you are egocentric angler posing with your big carp, well, that is unethical. But the same event done for protection of the species is seen ethical. And because this is really complex, lawmakers say, I don't care, this is too complex for me, I ban catch and release entirely. I don't want to deal with that thing. I know there's some societal disrespect for the activity per se, so they implement the most strict regulations simply to reduce discussion. Right? So this explains why voluntary catch and release is prohibited, while actually many people would totally accept it, even today, in an egalitarian society. And it might also explain why the UK, for example, has actually implemented a total catch and release policy, despite having a very animal welfare-oriented society. So different societies can come up with different solutions to the same problem. Nevertheless, current developments actually say that many of the countries will go into this upper right corner, and if you look carefully into the news, into which countries have developed animal welfare-oriented critiques or discussions or discourses, you will find all the countries here. Switzerland has prohibited catch and release. Actually, animals are entitled to have a lawyer. Really. Animals are entitled to have a lawyer. So there are lawyers that speak for the animals. And animals have dignity in Switzerland. That's a state statement. So it's fascinating. It's Switzerland. We have the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden. I know from colleagues a lot of discussion goes on, particularly in Norway currently. And of course Germany is on the top here, but there's also Australia. Ben Dickless is here who is struggling with these problems. Australians are talking about that. So there is a message here. As soon as you move to the right, you can expect such type of animal welfare-oriented discussion to happen. So that concludes my talk. I want to give you 4 conclusions and implications. The first is that values, from a social psychological perspective, are moral guideposts, a moral compass that guides both individuals but also society at the cultural level. These values are formed very early in life. They change very slowly. They transcend situations, and they are behaviorally and culturally relevant. We can't do a lot of it against change. We have to be aware that it happens and that will affect our research. As a researcher in Germany, doing a fish experiment is extremely difficult. It affects angling participation, it affects management of fisheries, and affects also the moral acceptability. Value change across the world is ongoing, with economic development usually, and it shapes the cultural, institutional, and social environment. Values directly affect policies, as you have seen in the German case, participation, management, and the morality of fishing. It also affects, that's very important, I didn't talk about it, who enters into fisheries and wildlife degrees. If you have had a couple of cohorts in university, you might have noticed that the new generation of students are very biodiversity oriented. They often go to fisheries program, don't fish, and dislike fishing on moral grounds. And that's the new generation that comes through the programs and then will, of course, at some point take up positions and that affect policies, etc. So that's how cultural change affects change in society. And I would predict, boldly maybe, but I would predict that the moral burden on recreational fishing is bound to increase, particularly as societies become modernized, and the legal actions are, however, most likely under egalitarian societies. So the US, being a mastery-oriented society, is pretty immune against legal action. And that's what colleagues tell me. It's not a big deal currently because that society has not moved into the left egalitarian area. So expect diversity among cultures to happen and to persist. So don't take my talk as a deterministic talk. It's a probabilistic talk about some things that we as professionals might want to think about more and study more. So with that, I want to thank my co-author, Carsten Riepe, who did this nationwide studies with me, my group, for discussing all of this, and of course the funders. And I'm very grateful for you for paying attention, SCKL for inviting me, and the gang for organizing a smooth conference. I wish you a great next 3 days. I'm happy to talk about this over the next coming days. Thank you very much.